The attack on October 7th was like volcanic anger, erupting after years of oppression.
And Israel's response to that anger.
Swift, forceful. Military operations launched in both Gaza and Lebanon, and unfortunately a devastating number of casualties.
It's almost 42,000 casualties in Gaza alone and over 2,000 in Lebanon. Just staggering numbers.
And it's easy to get lost in the numbers, right? But these are human lives, families, communities completely devastated. There was this quote from a UN official, and it's chilling. They said, "It seemed like there were no civilians as far as Israel was concerned." Almost like a disregard for civilian life.
That is disturbing. Is this where Mustafa Bayoumi, the author we have an excerpt from, comes in? With that whole two-sidesism idea?
Exactly. Like, it's so easy to fall into the trap of presenting this conflict as two sides, both equally to blame. But he's urging us to look deeper at the power dynamics.
Okay, I see what you mean. We have to understand who has power and who doesn't in this situation to really understand what he's getting at.
Absolutely. You've got Israel, a state with a powerful military and international backing. And on the other side, the Palestinians, who have endured decades of displacement and dispossession. It's a huge power imbalance, and it shapes everything, how this conflict plays out on the ground, how it's reported in the media, everything.
It seems like whenever we're dealing with a conflict with this much history, this much baggage, the question of who controls the narrative becomes super important. And looking at our sources, there are definitely some strong opinions about that, especially when it comes to how the media covers this conflict.
Yeah, because narratives have power, right? They shape how we see the world, how we understand it. And when it comes to a conflict like this, it can literally be a matter of life or death. Well, the gist is that Western media coverage often ends up favoring Israel's narrative. I mean, Western media either downplaying or just completely ignoring, like silencing key aspects of the Palestinian story. They're saying this has been going on for decades.
And then there was that whole controversy with the 40 beheaded babies right at the beginning of the conflict. Even President Biden mentioned it before having to retract it.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a perfect example, like a textbook example of what Dawn's talking about, this horrific story, but completely unsubstantiated, no evidence. But it spreads like wildfire, right? And sparks outrage around the world. Yet at the same time, you have documented deaths of Palestinian children, like those from the Rafah airstrike, or that UNICEF estimate of 13,000 child casualties. Those barely get a mention in comparison.
It's like what gets amplified, what gets silenced, whose story matters and whose doesn't.
Exactly. And that's exactly what Khaled Beidan was talking about, that legal scholar we were reading, that quote of his about the lie of headless Israeli children versus the truth of beheaded Palestinian children. Tough to hear, but
it really makes you think about whose lives are valued and whose aren't.
Exactly, yeah.
So even with the best intentions in the world, a journalist might end up framing a story in a way that reinforces these biases.
That's exactly it. It's not always about outright lies, right? It can be these really subtle things, the language that's used, how a story is framed. Mona Chalabi, that data journalist, she did some fascinating work on this, actually.
Yeah, what did she find?
So she looked at a bunch of different articles, and she found this pattern. Israeli victims were often humanized. They were given names, faces, backstories. Readers could empathize. But Palestinian victims, on the other hand, they were often just like nameless statistics.
Dehumanized.
Exactly. And we saw something similar in that BBC language analysis you picked out. Weren't they looking at how the word massacred was being used?
Oh, right. Yes.
And they found this huge discrepancy. It was way more likely to be used when describing Israeli deaths. So again, it's like this subtle linguistic bias that can creep in, and it might be unintentional, but it could really shape how we perceive, the severity of violence committed by each side.
It's not just what's being said, it's how it's being said, right? And then on top of that, you have the issue of dissenting voices being silenced altogether, which Islam Webb brought up.
And it's a real concern, I mean, look at those Muslim news anchors who were suspended by MSNBC for expressing empathy for Palestinians, or those LA Times staffers who weren't allowed to report on Gaza if they signed that letter, criticizing Israel's actions. It's silencing.
It creates this climate of fear, doesn't it? Like you can't even question the dominant narrative, even if you're a journalist, even if you've got the credentials.
Yeah, and social media isn't any better. Azmat Khan, she's a prize-winning journalist, right?
Yeah.
Even she talked about being shadow banned on some platforms after she posted about Gaza.
Wow. It's like straight up censorship. And it's not just journalists, everyday people being silenced for sharing their perspective. It makes that quote about Palestinians being described as human animals all the more chilling. That quote about human animals, I mean, it's hard to even repeat. It gets under your skin. Like, how can anyone use language like that, especially in a situation where people are dying?
It's dehumanizing. And it's dangerous.
Mhm.
Because once you take away someone's humanity, it's easier to justify doing horrible things, you know,
Mm,
easier to justify violence.
yeah.
And we have to be so careful about the language we use, especially when we're talking about something as sensitive and as deadly as this conflict. We have to move beyond these really simplistic narratives, you know. We can't just say both sides and wash our hands of it. We have to acknowledge the power imbalances, the historical context. It's not about ignoring wrongdoing on either side. It's about understanding that context matters.
So looking at the nuances, the complexities, not just taking the easy way out.
Exactly. And being willing to look at our own biases.
Yeah.
You know, like what do we bring to the table when we approach this issue? Where are we getting our information? Are we even trying to find different perspectives, or are we just sticking with what we already believe?
It's a lot of responsibility when you think about it like that.
It is. And it's not just on us as individuals either. We have to demand better from our media. You know, call out bias when we see it. Hold them accountable for silencing dissenting voices, for perpetuating harmful stereotypes.
That piece we read about how people who mainly get their news from cable news are more likely to support Israel's actions, whereas people who engage more with social media and podcasts, they tend to be more critical. That's kind of telling, isn't it?
It is. And it's not that
Yeah.
social media is perfect, not at all. But it shows that there's potential there for different voices to break through, to
Yeah.
challenge those narratives that we've been talking about. And there's a real hunger for that, for more nuance, less bias.
And we're seeing that with all the activism that's been happening, especially among younger people. It feels like they're not afraid to call out injustice, to make noise about it, even when it's, I don't know, uncomfortable.
They're inheriting this world with all its baggage, and they're saying we deserve better.
Yeah.
And that's powerful. To see that kind of commitment, that push for change.
We talked about Edward Said earlier and that quote of his about, Israel's collective delusion and how long it might take for there to be a real shift, a real awakening. It's a bit of a downer, honestly. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think that's the question I want to leave everyone with. What role are you going to play? Are you going to be a passive observer, or are you going to engage with this? Are you going to challenge yourself, your own biases, and be a voice for a more peaceful, more just world? That's something we all need to think about.